Hey guys, welcome to my time-lapse workshop. Really excited to have you here. We're just gonna jump right into it. This is gonna be a class that's set up into 3 different categories. First, I'm gonna show you how to set up your camera. So if you have your camera, go ahead and grab it because we're gonna want that. And I'm gonna show you all the settings you need to set your camera to so that you can shoot a successful, beautiful time-lapse. And then in our second part, we're gonna go out and actually shoot. I'm gonna show you what subjects to shoot, how you probably should set up your composition, the lighting you should look for, and a lot of other little details, and we'll get into that when we actually get to the shooting phase. And then in the third part, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a step-by-step process and how you can use Davinci Resolve to transcode and edit and process all the time-lapse information that we shoot during this course. Now, if at any point you have a question, just let me know. I'll be happy to answer that to you, or answer that for you, I should say, at the end of the program. So what we're going to do first is we're going to jump right into the camera. I'm going to be using the Sony a7 R4, which is my favorite time-lapse camera. If you're not using a Sony camera, you can also just follow along. Most cameras have all of the basic settings, so this isn't going to be just for Sony, but we will be using the Sony a7 R4 for this. And as you can see behind me, I've got the a7 R3 as well. If you have the a7S III, the menu system is a little bit different, so that's why we're keeping it just to the R4 and below. That way we can work with what we have, with probably what a lot of people have actually. So it'll be fun. All right, so the first thing you want to do is you want to pick the lens out that you want to use. And for most time-lapse shots that I like, I probably want to use something wide, something like a 16-35 or a 12-24. But you can also use other fixed lenses like the 25, a 35, or even a 50mm lenses. Now, what happens when you use longer lenses is it condenses the scene and it really reduces the amount of elements that you can time-lapse. That's not to say you can't use a long lens like a 50mm or even a 100mm. You just have to be careful in what your subject is. So for this, we're just going to use a wide-angle lens. I've got the 16-35 here. It's one of my favorite time-lapse lenses to use, next to the new 12-24, which is, well, I should say that they're both my favorite ones to use. The 12-24 is pretty awesome too right now because it's a 2.8 aperture, which means it's amazing for astrophotography. So if you're doing any kind of low light situation shooting, you're going to be able to capture a massive amount of content or frame in the resolution with that lens. That being said, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. So you're going to get your camera out, and what we'll do is we'll attach the lens to this. I always make sure when you put the lens on and put it upside down because you don't want dust or dirt getting into the sensor. And that way it keeps your sensor clean, and when you're shooting, you're not going to have dust or debris on the sensor. And that's a big thing because if you do have that, once you get into post-production, it's going to be a hassle to try to remove that. So next, obviously take your lens cap off. And we're not going to be doing a lot of advanced settings on this. This is a basic class, but we're just going to start this off by turning your camera to manual mode. So we'll turn the camera to manual. That's a big M on your camera. And the reason we're not using shutter priority or aperture priority is because all of those different settings will actually change and create what's called flicker inside your time lapse. And while it is possible to remove the flicker, it's also possible you can add other defects. So if you put it on shutter priority, it's going to change the aperture over time. And if you change the aperture, it's going to change the depth of field as you're shooting if the lighting changes. So you don't want that. So we want to make sure that our aperture is fixed, and we also want to make sure that everything else is fixed. Now this also includes image stabilization. If you're using a lens that has IS or vibration reduction or any kind of stabilization, you want to make sure that you turn it off. The same goes for inside the menu system of your Sony. If you're using steady shot, you want to make sure that that's turned off. So you can go inside the menu system, do this really quick. And I've set up these favorite items, basically allow me to do all of what I need to do for my time-lapse mode. So the first one I have is I have this set up as a format that allows me to format the camera when I'm ready to go. That way I can start with fresh cards and it's right there, ready to rock and roll. I also have a file format changer, so if I'm shooting RAW or JPEG, I can switch between the two, so I can go between RAW and JPEG very easily. For the majority of our time, we want to make sure that we're shooting on RAW. So go ahead and select the RAW setting for that. Now this can be under camera 1 if you're looking for that RAW setting, and you're just going to go to file format, hit RAW, and there we go. We also want to make sure that long noise reduction is turned off. If you look here, it's usually standard to default to on for most cameras, so we want to make sure that that's off. And what happens with the noise reduction is if we are doing long-term time-lapse or long exposure time-lapse, it's going to create a black frame to go on top of that to create a less noiseless image. So we want to eliminate that because we can eliminate the noise in post. So go ahead and just change it to noise reduction off. And you can do the same thing to high ISO noise reduction if it is enabled for you. And the next thing we want to make sure, again, we want to make sure that our setting for the image stabilization is turned off. So if you go under the second movie setting, under the steady shot, so it's second movie or second camera, file 11 or 5 out of 11, you're going to go ahead and turn steady shot to off. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow you to have a steady shot without it on, because this is going to be landing on top of a tripod. So if the steady shot was on, there's a possibility the steady shot can activate and it'll start rolling the shutter. And when you're doing that, what's going to happen is, or sorry, not the shutter, it's going to start rolling the sensor. And when you start doing that, it's going to create vibration and movement in the scene. And we don't want that. So we want to make sure that that's off. Now, the next thing we want to do is we can either turn silent shooting on or off. I actually like to leave it on so we can hear it as it's going. We know if we don't hear that, that means either that the camera's done shooting or B, the camera has failed somehow. So we always want to make sure that we leave that on so we can listen. Now, let's get to the settings part. And when we talk about the settings for the camera, the settings are going to be different for every single situation. If you're in a very bright situation, we could be using ND filters and then a slow shutter speed, or we could be using a faster aperture or a lower ISO or a high ISO. It really just depends on the exposure. Now, the one thing and consistent thing that we want to make sure is, for the most part, we want to have our shutter speed under 1/30th of a second. That's not to say you can't have a faster shutter speed, but at under 1/30th of a second, it's going to blur things that are moving faster through the scene. And for the most part, we want to have this, if we can, even farther below 1/30th, even to like half a second to 1 second. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a beautiful drag in our shot. It's what we call shutter dragging. And it's going to create streaks of light. It's going to create streaks of motion. So if you see people or cars, you'll see a nice little streak coming off of them. And it really creates a much more magical, much more cinematic kind of feeling. And that's what we want to go for. We want to create not just basic time-lapse, we want to create really exciting cinematic time-lapse. And that's what's really going to draw your viewer in. If we use slower shutter speeds, we're going to be able to achieve that. And to achieve slower shutter speeds, you want to make sure you use ND filters. Now, I am using case ND or case and internal ND filters, and they go directly over the sensor, which is wonderful. If you don't have any type of internal ND filters, what you can do is a external one using a matte box. And that just goes on the front of the lens, or you can even do a screw-on. But I would recommend, if you have one, to go out and get an ND filter of at least 4 to 6 stops. And that's going to allow you in broad daylight to shoot anywhere from half a second all the way up to 2 or 3 seconds, which is great because that is going to, again, allow us to create motion trails in our shots. After that's done, we want to make sure that anything and everything that has an auto feature or functionality on it is turned off. We want to set our white balance to whatever the scene is. So if we're out on a nice, bright, sunny day, we want to go ahead and set that to sun or 5600 Kelvin. If we're inside interiors, if there's tungsten or incandescent lighting, we want to turn that to that. Because if we use auto white balance on this, what's going to happen is you're going to see a rolling color effect happen every time the color shifts. So if the light changes just slightly or another light element enters the scene, what's going to do is it's going to create a color shift. And you're going to see that when you actually put this together in the time lapse. And it kind of looks like a funky like shimmer across the picture, because you'll see the white balance just inconsistently pulsate and change over time. And we don't want that. So we want to make sure that we have a consistent white balance. And to do that, we just want to make sure that our white balance is set to a consistent point. You can always go back into the raw data and change that at any time, which is great. The next thing we want to make sure also is that we use a fast aperture. If we use a slower aperture, and I should say this in context, a slow aperture is anything above, f5. So f5 to f22, that's a very slow aperture. Or a very fast aperture would be anything like f1.2 all the way up to f 3.5 or 4. 4 would be like the cusp of that. But the reason we want to have a fast aperture is because if you use a very slow aperture, it's going to allow you to see any kind of dust, defects, or debris that's on the sensor. And if you're shooting time-lapse, you definitely don't want that, because then it becomes a headache when it comes to post-production. So what you're gonna wanna do is either use a 2.8 lens or a 3.5 lens, or if you have to, an f4, but you wanna shoot at the fastest possible aperture. And again, you may need to use an ND filter if it's too bright, because that aperture will be opened up all the way. You'll see that iris just blossom open. But that's gonna be really important, because you really just don't want to have those defects on there when you're editing. And it makes the whole process simpler. Now, the next thing too is you wanna make sure that autofocus is turned off, right here. And you wanna switch to manual mode. But it's also important that you do focus before you begin shooting. So you can use autofocus right at the beginning, so you can do that and then autofocus on your subject. And once you get the green autofocus highlighter, you go ahead and switch it off, and that just means that your focus is set. You don't have to touch the focus ring, and then you'll be good to go. If you leave autofocus on during the shooting, what's going to happen is you'll see the subject jump back and forth, and it creates a very jarring image. And believe me, I've done it myself hundreds of times. It's really annoying, and you basically ruin the shot. So again, anything and everything that has an auto feature on the camera needs to be turned off. There are certain instances where you can use Aperture Priority. That'll be for another class, but Aperture Priority is great for doing transitions from day into night. And if you are interested in that, you can always come to me and I can show you some tutorials I have on that subject, but that'll be for another day. And if you are using a high megapixel camera like the A7R IV, you want to make sure that the data that you're using or the storage that you're using is fast. For this in particular one, I've got a 64 gigabyte, 300 megasecond G Master card. These are wonderful. You really want to ensure if you are having high data rates that you use fast cards, because when it comes to the transfer process, it could take you, 10, 20 minutes, if not longer, if you're using slower cards. With this, you can get about 64 megs off the card in a matter of just a few minutes, which is great. And again, you should always be prepared to have more cards on hand too, because with time-lapse, you're taking raw still frames. So if we're taking 400, 600, or 800 frames, that's going to be a lot of space and a lot of data that's taken up. So we want to make sure that you have enough space. So carry a couple extra 64 gig cards or even a couple 128 gig cards, and that's really going to help you, plan for the future if you're doing a lot of shooting. So on most time-lapse jobs that I'm on, I'll bring a couple 256 gig cards, and that's going to allow me to put on maybe 4 to 5 shots per card, which is great, because then I can condense that and put that all into my file structure, and it's great. And we'll talk about that when we get to the post-production process. And the last thing before we start is we want to make sure that we go into our intervalometer setting, because this is going to be the most important thing when it comes to shooting the time-lapse. If your camera doesn't have an internal intervalometer, don't worry. You can also grab one of these. This is just an external intervalometer. You can purchase this from Amazon or B&H or Adorama, but they're usually pretty cheap, a couple bucks. And these are great because they plug right directly into your camera, and you can control it just from the tip of your fingers. Now, if you do have an internal intervalometer, what we're going to do is I'm going to go inside the menu system here, and I've already preset my buttons, my C2 up here, to be my internal intervalometer, so I can just easily access it whenever I want. I'd recommend, if you are planning to shoot time-lapse professionally, just assign the intervalometer button to one of these custom buttons on the top or on the side. So I'm going to go into the menu system here. I'm going to open up my internal intervalometer section. It should say intervalometer shoot function. And you're going to see a screen that looks very similar to this. And within this screen, we've got interval shooting, we've got shooting start time, we've got shooting interval, number of shots, AE tracking, silent shoot on interval, and then interval priority. The most important part here is we want to have our shooting interval. And the shooting interval is really going to be important to what subject we're shooting. For the most part, our interval is going to be somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds. If you're shooting longer things like shadows, that could be anywhere in the range of 8 to 15 seconds. But for what we want to do here, we're just going to keep it at about 2 seconds for the interval. So go ahead and go to interval shooting, change that number to 2. And the number of shots is also important too. So if you're thinking about putting this into video standards, you need to divide whatever the number of shots you are wanting by 24, and that's 24 frames per second. And that's going to allow us to see 1 second of footage every 24 frames. So 400 is what I would suggest putting that at. And then for the most part, there's nothing else you need to touch. All right, so once that's ready and set up, you can go ahead and you want to turn that shooting mode to on. So under interval shooting, just take it from off to on. And now, whenever you hit the trigger button here, you're gonna see a menu pop up in the back of the screen, and it's gonna show you that the time-lapse is progressing. Now, we can go back into that time-lapse menu too, really quick, and where it says shooting start time, we can change that to, let's just say, 5 seconds. And what that's gonna allow you to do is once you hit that button, it's gonna allow you 5 seconds to step away from the camera. Again, we don't wanna have anything touching the camera because any kind of vibration is going to ruin the shot. So you'll just click the button, step back, and we're ready to rock and roll. Now that we have our interval menu system set up, we can go out and start shooting. So this is where we're gonna make our magic. Let's do this. All right, and we're back, we're outside, we're in our time-lapse element. I've got my camera set up. But you know, I also want to point out that it's been raining here in my location for the last week or so, so I haven't really gotten the opportunity to actually time-lapse anything that's substantial. So we're gonna have to put on our magic thinking caps and envision that there's really beautiful white puffy clouds flying over the sky, because that's ultimately what we want to show in our time-lapse. So this is just gonna show you a demonstration of how to set the camera up, and I'll go over the points of, you know, the composition, what to look out for, and we'll go from there. Once we get to the post-production phase, I'll actually bring up some puffy white clouds that I had shot previously, and that should hopefully allow you to see the full process from start to finish. So let's just dive right in. I've got my camera set up here. This is the A7R3. I've got the 16-35 on it. What you want to do is you want to make sure that your camera is already in manual focus. So if it's in autofocus, go ahead and throw it into manual focus. The next thing we want to check out is the composition. You want to find an area that has lots of layers. So you want to look for a foreground, a middle ground, and background. And with clouds, that's really easy because you want to have at least 2/3 of the sky in your shot. So when you're looking out and you're looking to frame up a shot, make sure that you have that nice 2/3 window that shows, you know, majority of the sky and then some of that landscape below. That's going to give you the best type of shot when it comes to post-production. So things you want to look out for, and these are really important because they're going to ultimately impact the time-lapse when you're shooting them, are birds. If you have birds flying through your scene, they're going to pop up like little specks of black dots on your shot, and you don't want that. So really make sure you're in an area that you've visited before, that if you are shooting off, let's just say from the balcony of your house here, that you witness where those birds are, because you don't want to be shooting in a location that has a lot of birds or a lot of animal movement, because it's really going to show up on the frame and really just kind of cause a distraction for your audience. So that's one. The next thing you want to look for is foliage. What we have behind us right here is a terrible place to shoot time-lapse because all of those leaves, all of those branches are just moving ever so slightly, and they're gonna cause what looks like vibrations in your shots. So you really wanna make sure that if you are shooting foliage, like nice autumn trees that we have in the background here, that you're a distance away from them so that their movement isn't so prevalent in the frame. The same goes for foreground. If you have any kind of like foliage like grass or wheat or anything that's just swaying in the wind, you want to make sure that your camera isn't very close to it, because what ultimately is going to happen again is going to cause this like fluttering vibration movement in the shot, and you don't want that. So again, make sure that everything is clear, free, you've got a really beautiful layout on your composition, and then you also want to check the direction that the clouds are moving. If you want a shot where the clouds are moving over you want to position your camera to where you're going into the clouds. If the clouds you want to show going away from you, again, position your camera so they're going away from you. You really want to have the foresight when you go out to shooting of all these different elements. And the same thing can be said for the elements of the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. The more elements of motion you have, the more interesting your time-lapse shot is going to be. So let's just say we're down in DC, we're shooting the Washington Monument. You'll have all these beautiful layers of people going in the foreground, clouds passing in the background, cars in the middle ground, foreground, and background, and all those different elements are going to add to make a much more interesting and dynamic time-lapse. All right, so let's go ahead and get our camera set up as if we are shooting this time-lapse for real. So we are shooting the clouds. Let's just imagine that there's nice, beautiful, white, puffy clouds in the sky, and they're moving pretty fast. If the clouds are moving pretty fast, you want to be using a faster interval, somewhere between a 1 to 2 second interval. So we're going to go ahead and set our camera up for a 2-second interval, and we're going to do that by jumping right into the back of the menu system here. So I have my camera turned on, just like that. And then we'll go into our menu system, we'll go into our interval shoot function. We'll come down to the shooting interval, and I've got it currently set up for 4 seconds, so we're going to change that from 4 seconds to 2 seconds. And what that means is every 2 seconds the camera is going to click and take a picture. And after we set up our entire shot, all those pictures are going to be combined together to create video, and that's what's ultimately going to give us our beautiful time lapse. The next thing we want to look at are the number of shots we have. So I'm going to select this. It's currently set at 1500, but that's way too many shots. We're going to keep this at 400 frames, and on a 24p timeline, 24 frames equates to about 16 seconds of usable footage. And you'll notice down on the little intervalometer screen here, it's going to actually tell us how long this shot's going to take. So it's going to take 13 minutes and 18 seconds to shoot. And that means for the next 13 minutes and 18 seconds, this camera is just going to be shooting stationary and will continue through the duration until it reaches 400 frames. Now, before we start shooting, we want to make sure that we have a couple settings disabled or enabled, depending on what we're doing. But we always want to make sure, again, just like we talked about before, that everything that is auto is turned off. So make sure that your white balance is set. It's a cloudy, kind of gray day here, so we'll set it to our cloudy white balance. And then you also want to make sure that your aperture, shutter speed, and focus are all set to manual as well. Other than that, you're going to have a great time shooting. Make sure that you're using a sturdy tripod. You'll want to make sure that if you can, weight down the tripod, because any vibration that touches the tripod is going to cause defects in your shot, and we don't want that. So put it in a location that's secure, that you know no one is going to tamper with, that you know that you'll have full control over with at some point, and that you know that it's just going to be sturdy, because that's ultimately going to give you the best time-lapse shot possible. So we've got everything set up here, and want to make sure that our horizon is level. Got that. And I'm going to be shooting at a wide 16 millimeters, so it really encompasses the entire frame of the background. And this is great for clouds, because the wider you get with the clouds, the more interesting it looks like when they fly overhead. You could even do it, if you wanted to, point the camera directly up into the sky and get a really cool top-down view of the clouds, or up-down view. You get the idea. You'll get a really cool view from the clouds. So once that's set up and you have your intervalometer ready to rock and roll, and you use the settings that you want to, generally speaking, you'll probably be wanting to use a moderately fast shutter speed if you don't have an ND filter, so somewhere around 1/30th of a second to 1/80th of a second. And then, you know, keeping that aperture, as we talked about below, 5.6, somewhere in that range, just so that the sensor dust doesn't show up on the camera. And then once that's started, you'll come in. We'll make sure that shooting interval is set to on. And in this camera, all you gotta do is click the shutter button, and you'll get a standby shooting. And we set that standby mode to 5 seconds, so that means you've got 5 seconds to walk away from the camera. And now it's starting to shoot. You'll get a little dialog box in the bottom left-hand corner that tells you how many shots out of how many shots it's completed. So here you can see that we've got 6 shots already rocking and rolling, and we're good to go. So that's really all you have to do for your time-lapse. Now you just get to sit back, enjoy the atmosphere that you're in, and then wait for your time-lapse to finish. Next, we're gonna hop on over to our post-production to show you all these images that we've collected, how to process them, how to color grade them, how to export them, and then ultimately how to put them out on the internet so everyone can see the beautiful work that you've done. All right, so let's get to it. All right, now that our time-lapse has finished, we've got all of our files. We're gonna go ahead and put them in a folder together. So you're gonna download it from your camera. This could take anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, but go ahead and put them neatly in a nice new folder, just like this. The next step, what we wanna do is we wanna convert all of these raw files and put them into a DNG format. This will help us edit natively once we get into the editing program. Davinci Resolve, which we'll be using to edit these, won't actually allow you to read Sony RAW files. So what we have to do is we have to convert them to DNG files, and you can do that easily by going to adobe.com and doing a search for Adobe Dng Converter. It's free. You can just download it and then open it up when you do. It looks just like this. So what we'll do is I'm going to find the folder that we have on our desktop here, which I've just marked as clouds. There we go. And then inside that folder, I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call that DNG. And we'll select this very shortly as to where we're going to be putting our processed DNG files at. Once that's done, I'm going to click back here really quick. Go ahead and hit select. And that's going to tell us that this is where we want to convert all of our files. So this is going to look for all of the raw files within our clouds folder. Now I'm going to select where we're going to be saving our files to. So I'll click select folder. I'm going to click that DNG folder that we just created, hit select. And from here, we're going to label our time lapse what it is. So I'm going to say clouds. And then I use a 5-digit serial number. That way, if you're shooting a lot of frames, you don't have to worry about having or doing duplicates of shots. So we're going to start our running number at 000. And then once that's completed, all these preferences down here you don't have to worry about. We just hit convert. And then you're going to see this pop up on screen here. And we did 700 shots for this particular shot. Obviously, this was not what we were shooting out just a second ago, but this is something that I shot previously. So we're going to be doing 700 shots. You should be doing about 400 shots, which would give you about 16 seconds. So this process can take anywhere from just a few seconds to a couple minutes. It really just depends on the speed and the power that you have in your computer. So just give it a minute, and then once it's done converting, we're going to go inside of Davinci Resolve, which you can go and get for free at davinciresolve.com, and you can download the free version of it, which will allow you to do everything that we're doing today. And if you want to expand your skills, you can go out and get the studio version, which I would really recommend because it really opens up a whole new avenue of processing capabilities. So now that we're almost done with our images, we'll see that they are going to be then put into this folder right here in our DNG folder. And if you are using a Mac computer, we are currently working on Windows, I would say that this workflow should be the same or very similar, but you may need to add or subtract a few different steps. Everything has been converted here. I'm going to click OK. Then we'll click Exit. And then we're going to click on our Resolve. And once it gets loaded, you're going to see a screen like this. This is going to be our main intro screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. We're going to label that Clouds Time-Lapse. Hit Create. And then we're going to come under our new window. So what we want to do, and this may look daunting if you've never used Davinci Resolve before, but I assure you it's super easy and very fluid. So what we'll do is we'll click on Edit. We're going to open up our time-lapse folder again, and what you can do is you just take this DNG folder, don't have to worry about opening it, you just click, drag, and take it over to this bin where it says Media Pool, and we drop it in. And now we can see that we have our raw time-lapse chilling by itself, which is fantastic. So we're going to take this and drag it down to our timeline. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see it in its entirety. And if I play this back right now, you're going to see that it's kind of dull. There's not a lot of color to this, and that's because through the DNG conversion process, it actually strips some of the color information. But one of the great things about shooting RAW is that we have all this information to work with. Now, this is an 8K timeline, so it really depends on what kind of system you're using, but you could have slow playback or you could have fast playback. But right now we're playing back at 24 frames per second. We can see that it's clearly doing its job nicely. But let's go ahead and get inside and start editing. The next thing we want to do is hit color, and we're going to take and transform this dull color into something that's a little bit more beautiful. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see a little picture camera that's for the raw camera settings, and we're going to go to decode using and select clip. And now everything that we would have had inside of, let's say, Adobe Lightroom or even Capture One, we're going to have the ability to change all of the raw settings here. So I'm going to go ahead and increase our color, just so we bring that color back in. Give it a little bit of a saturation boost, bring out some of those shadows, really brighten up a bit, and then increase our exposure. We want to increase it to where we can see all of the highlights, but we're not blowing out, and then we can see everything. So we can just see our whole image transforming, and then we can also change our color temperature at the same time. So it's a little yellow, so I'm going to bring this down, make it a little more blue. And then I'll reduce the highlights a little bit. And then I will increase our mid-tone detail, and this is going to make it a little bit more sharper and stand out. I'm going to give it a little more gain just to pop it, make it a little bit more contrasty. And now if we play this back, we're going to see our beautiful clouds playing back in their natural format. Now you may notice that we have some black bars here on the left and the right side. We are watching it in its native format. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and change that. And we'll go back to our edit button right down here, and then click on our inspector, and we're going to transform our zoom by increasing it just a little bit. And now we have this beautiful composition. Congratulations, you just created your first time lapse. So this is pretty much it. You can always get in and do a little bit more. You can go in and adjust different levels and different tones, and you can really make the image the way you want it to be. Now, of course, this is just a very basic class. You can also use Davinci Resolve to do day to night ramping. So if you have shot a sunset or even Milky Way, you can come into Resolve and do the exact same steps, going into the color system and then making it to your liking. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to deliver or export this footage out. So I'm going to create an in and out point. I'm going to click I for in over here, and then O for out over here. And then we're going to go to our Deliver tab, which is in the bottom right hand corner. We're going to select H.264 master. And that's going to give us our settings down here as a QuickTime H.264. And we can then change the resolution to whatever we want to be. Now you can choose whatever resolution you want. Obviously you want to stay within the constraints of the resolution that you shot. So if you're shooting at an 8K or a 10K frame, you can obviously choose the 8K setting or resolution. But I would stick with either the 1080p or the 4K. For this instance, we're just going to do 1080p, so I'm going to select the 1080p. And you don't really have to worry or mess with anything else. The only thing we really have to do is change the name here. We're going to say Cloud Time-Lapse. We're going to pick the location, and you can either pick the same folder location that we shot before, or you can just put it straight to your desktop. I'm going to put it right in the same location that we shot. That way we have all of the information together in one nice, neat little place. Click Save, come down to Add to Render Queue, click the Render Queue, and then hit Start Render. And this could take a few seconds or it could take a few minutes. It truly just depends on the system hardware that you have. But if you are running on a pretty beefy piece of hardware, you can see that obviously it only takes a few seconds here. We're tracking in at about 15 seconds for the entire render, which is pretty fast. All right, well, that's going to do it. You guys just completed your first time lapse. Congratulations. Now, if you guys have any questions, I'm going to be taking your questions live, and then we'll go from there. Thanks for joining me.